Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library and Camilla and Mickey and Peter. Oh, hi, Mickey. I was like, where are you? Thank you for helping us, and thank you for hosting. I am with the Minnesota Historical Society. Candace and I are in the Inclusion and Community Engagement Department. I also am the chair of the Education Committee of the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League. And they were kind enough to also sponsor this event. I was really focused on getting good cookies for us. So when they were like, well, you have to do the introduction, I was like, what? But I'm happy to be here. And I met Scott, a couple years ago. I don't think he remembers me, but we were at the Asian Pacific Islander Historic Preservation Conference, and I knew of your work because of your work with the Japanese American Citizens League in Detroit, I believe, and Michigan. And I knew of your work with Grace Lee Boggs, and I was really blown away by your speaking at that conference. And I think I went up to you, I waited in line, went up to you and was like, hey, you should come to the Twin Cities. So here you are, and I'm really excited to have you here. We are gonna have Boggs start us off. And again, I apologize for not having your official bio. Okay, everybody knows you. But I'll try to my best here. So Baufi is a 2-time Minnesota Grand Slam champion and a National Poetry Slam finalist. His poems and essays are widely published in numerous publications, including Screaming Monkeys and Spoken Word Revolution Redux. He has also released several CDs of his poetry. A short... if you know what those are. A short story of his, Revolution Shuffle, appeared in the anthology Octavia's Brood, Stories from Social Justice Movements. And an essay of his was included in the anthology A Good Time for the Truth, edited by Sun Young Shin, who... Oh, wow, congratulations on your award, too. Yes, Sun Young recently won an award, I think a couple weeks ago, so congratulations. And so Baufi's books are also available, as Candace mentioned. And so without further ado, thank you. Welcome up to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kimmy. Thanks to Eastside Freedom Library, Japanese American Citizens League, Minnesota Historical Society, all of you all for bringing us together. Don't buy my book, buy Scott's book. And I'm not saying that to be falsely modest. Scott, you remember when we were talking years ago, and you were like, I want to write this book. Do you remember that conversation? And my response to you was like, please, good God, Scott, fucking write this book. Please, please, please do it. And so that's what I mean. Don't buy my book, buy his book. Really, this book is super important, and I'm not just saying that because he's here. You know, I get into so many arguments with people about who believe like Asians are closest in proximity to whiteness and all that bullshit. And like now I can just throw your book at them. I don't have to argue anymore. I'm like, here, just read that. And thank you all for coming. I only have 2 poems for you today, and I'm not thanking you all just for the sake of ceremony. I'm just gonna say that as an Asian American in Minnesota, although the past few months have been very inspiring, it's also been really frustrating in that if people mention race in Minnesota, they frequently say Black, Native, and Latinx, completely erasing both our struggles with ICE and state-sanctioned violence and also our resistance. In particular, Southeast Asian people have been fighting against deportation for decades, and we're part of the people who created the infrastructure to make some of this activism work, and yet we are completely missing from the narrative. And both Scott and Bo will be talking more about this later because it also ties into anti-Asian violence, a lot of things, how it's not legible to a lot of folks. And so that is what I mean when I say thank you for showing up today, because you all showing up today matters. I'm going to read 2 poems about anti-Asian violence. One is very grumpy. I'm going to start with that one because I want to end more hopeful. So during all the anti-Asian violence that was happening during COVID, those of us who know Asian American history, which is why this book is so important, know that that was not the first time, right? We are the bad ones whenever someone needs a punching bag. That is that's America's history. So for me, it was perplexing to hear a lot of people, including Asian Americans, say, "Oh, now I know what it's like to be a person of color." I'm like, the fuck are you talking about? And so I wrote this poem. To the people to the people who have resisted the urge to push an Asian person into the path of a moving train. We are the lines we won't cross. Who hasn't given up their seat to a man who says he can't stand to sit with his back to the door? Who hasn't waited, preoccupied with the thoughts of escaping this or that war or sweatshop or relationship? To be Asian American is to be told what you deserve. By now, learning that almost all stories in life end in some type of heartbreak. Exhausted, you turn your back. And in so doing, make yourself vulnerable to the combustion that is human interaction. Every human being alive and dead is a cautionary tale. Before this, there never was before this. But if you don't know, many years, I've taught myself to walk between my child and any railing that they could be tossed over. Put myself between them and say, railroad tracks. Knowing others see us as moving targets in a steamed jungle, the way my parents did for me. Already so many ghosts. To be an Asian body in America is to belong nowhere. And what people cannot hold, they push. What if, instead of being the opposite of a trust exercise, we were made sails, and our purpose to safely turn our backs to a wind we can't see? Thank you. So this poem is salty too. I yell in this one too. But I will admit, because I'm a human being, I'm not good at this, but I'm trying very hard to convert the anger into something that is not vengeance. And so that is what this poem is. So instead of trying to get revenge, it's imagining a world without anti-Asian violence. And the title is called A Narrow Opening, which is one of the definitions of the word chink. Instead of a grandmother kicked in her face, 1,000 orchids blooming from each swinging foot. The stems and petals forming a fragrant face mask wrapped around every face, hers and yours. Instead of a man and his child stabbed in the face in a parking lot, all the knives turned to pens. Sentences flowing like blood as the story of their lives filled the body of flag after flag, embracing the wind from every single direction. Instead of acid poured onto a woman's face, we asked one another what our parents drank when they lost what meant the most to them. The lines on their faces a worn map to the unbearable, so they can find it even when they die. Instead of a nurse being dragged from a train, we all grow wings. There is no net big enough, no handle long enough. Instead of a rock thrown through a store window, there are no stores. We have everything we need and nothing more. Instead of fearing for the safety of my mother and father, they are hunched over sewing machines, stitches even as the needles dip up and down, the thread tight on the margins or it all falls apart. They sew masks to save your life, and so there is no need for me to keep screaming how they saved mine. Instead of you chinks brought the virus here, there is a chorus in a language no one understood but translated as beautiful. So loud you were shaken, and you learned the limitations of dancing how you've always been taught to dance. Instead of you people need to stop eating bats and rats, American history books fell off the shelves and burst into flames, and we cooked our dinners for one another, burnt in some places and raw in the other. In the dark, our families' backs are hunched with all they can carry, dodging the spotlight eyes of soldiers, the bark of their guns off leash. They always escape the men with guns we never forget. Instead of deportation, our bodies become boats. The ocean is impossible to border. The flags sink to a place where there's no light to see the sigils. We are all water, so we be like water. Here, mothers don't need dead sons or daughters before they are heard. Here, doctors and nurses don't need to stand in front of trucks as if they were tanks. We don't need to celebrate a day that a child isn't shot at school, because that is every day. The drones drop only bread. The boots float meaninglessly over the necks of our fathers. The bigots are too busy with therapy to pay us any mind. The police bullets all miss. The hottest flame is in your kitchen. Lovers are never the chameleon color of bruises. You see, you could lean down close to the face of the dying person who you love, say goodbye to their very last breath. It's not science, but rather science fiction, that the landmines are not landmines, but seeds. And like flowers bursting from the soil after winter, you are an explosion in bloom. And our elders look at their grandchildren the way a person looks at the rainbow after a tornado has taken their home, bit by bit, away into the very same sky. So really, I mean it when I say thank you, Scott, dearly for writing this book with so much heart. And what I love about this book is, I mean, it's frustrating as fuck to read, right? It's frustrating because of all these instances of violence against our people. And it's also frustrating that not a lot of people know this history. And so doing the work, thank you for doing the work. I'm just going to introduce you briefly. I'm not going to read your official bio. Scott has also written a book about Black and Asian communities in Los Angeles. Scott is an academic and an activist. He spent a lot of times in the twilight years in Detroit of Grace Lee Boggs' life, working very closely with Grace Lee Boggs and other activists there. And is just a great scholar, thinker, and activist. And I'm so glad you wrote this book. I'm so glad you chose to come to Minnesota. This is a big deal, folks. Like, usually big publishers, they don't necessarily send folks to Minnesota. And Scott had everything to do with that. You know what I'm saying? And so thank you, Scott. Without further ado, let's please welcome Scott Kurashige.
Wow, thank you so much. Before I get into my remarks, I wanted to thank Bao for bringing up my work with Grace Lee Boggs. I continue to serve as the president of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Foundation. We're doing work based on basically directives that Grace gave us in her will. And there's a very special guest in the audience today. Jeanette Lee is Grace's niece. And there she is. So her father was Grace's younger brother, Harry. And so just very honored to have Jeanette with us today. And we just met. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library. This is just an incredible space. My first time here. Thank you to Camila and Peter and David and everybody who makes this wonderful community space possible. Thank you to the Minnesota Historical Society, to Kimmy and Candace and everyone there working behind the scenes. Thank you to the JCL. And thank you to Shia Books for being here as well, and for the service you do, Vameng and everyone for the community. I'm just so honored to be here. This is really just a dream event in a dream location. Thank you, Thao-Urabe. I saw on your Instagram the description, silo busting possibilian. Grace would have loved that description. Somebody who brings together all her rich experiences as a Minnesotan, refugee, Hmong American, Asian American women's leader, community organizer, mother, and cross-cultural educator and advocate, and pushes us to come together to build something new, a model of how we can live together in peace and justice. Thank you so much, Bao Phi. This is just, again, a bucket list to have Bao, not just here, but to open up with 2 incredible poems. I've been such a fan for a long time. And there's an old adage that you should always write with a specific reader in mind. And I literally, I'm oftentimes thinking, if no one else but Bao Phi appreciates that I wrote this, it was worth writing. There's actually a longer story to that, but that is not a cliche. It's actually true. Because mainstream recognition can be nice, but it's very fleeting. And as Grace said, movements are born of critical connections rather than critical mass. Thank you for everyone for coming out today. Really, from the bottom of my heart, it's an honor to be here in this library and to be here with you in St. Paul and the Twin Cities. Your work has just been epic, a model of solidarity in the face of grotesque state violence and a rapidly escalating fascist assault on civil rights and democracy. It starts from a simple and fundamental point that Grace made in her later years. The only way to survive is by caring for one another. But it's no exaggeration to say that the organizing and resistance by Minnesotans, uniting tens and thousands of diverse peoples, has been integral to halting the momentum of the far right and the slide towards authoritarianism, and putting forward a model and a beacon for all of us. And though we all still have so much more work to do, I believe that we can already look back and say that what you all did in the bitter cold winter of 2026 has turned the tide and changed the course of history. And so with that in mind, I want to read an excerpt from chapter 9 of American Peril, which is titled, When the Police Cause More Harm. In September of 2006, I was helping to run a program for teenagers called Detroit Asian Youth Project. Participants came mainly from working class immigrant and refugee communities. Most attended schools that were majority black. Some of us have volunteered with Detroit Summer, a multicultural youth leadership program started by James and Grace Lee Boggs. While that organization especially drew African American participants, we launched Day Project in 2004 as a companion program to locate and connect with Detroit's sparsely populated Asian American community. At the time, it was the only pan-ethnic Asian activist group in the city of Detroit. We clicked first with a small but concentrated group of Hmong Americans living in the Osborne neighborhood within the city's northeast corner. Many of the youths had lived their entire lives in the city, but had never even visited downtown Detroit. None had taken any K-12 classes remotely touching on Asian American studies, but they taught us as much or more than we taught them. Shortly after school was back in session, we met on a Saturday morning for the first time since the end of our summer program. I casually asked them, what's new? We were going around the circle when Ben quietly and reluctantly spoke. My uncle died, he said. Ben was around 15, but his uncle was only 18. We all gasped. What happened? Several of us asked, seemingly in unison. He was killed by the police, Ben replied, setting off alarm bells in our head. It's in the news. Through talking further with Ben, reading the brief news accounts, and consulting with the family's attorney, I learned that Ben's uncle, Chonburi Zhang, had lived with his parents in Warren, Michigan. 4 police officers entered their basement where he slept and fired 40 shots. They struck him 27 times in his bed. It was self-defense, they asserted. Zhang pointed a pistol at them first. He was a troubled youth who had multiple run-ins with the law. The police action was prompted by his parents calling 911 to report a domestic incident. Officials entered the Zhang home. The Macomb County Prosecutor's Office concluded with, quote, probable cause to believe that Mr. Zhang posed a significant threat of death or serious bodily harm to themselves, his family, and the surrounding neighborhood. As such, quote, the use of deadly force was justified, end quote. No criminal charges were filed against the officers, who were also cleared of any disciplinary action following an internal investigation. Chonburi's family, however, told a different story. I learned this firsthand through an interview with his father, Pang Blia Zhang. Like many Hmong and Southeast Asian Americans, the Zhang family's connections to the U.S. were rooted in war and trauma. Quote, my name is Pang Blia Zhang. I was born in a small farming village in Laos on December 31st, 1956. I did not have much of a childhood because my country was torn apart by war. When the Americans came to Laos, they asked our people, the Hmong, to help fight the communists. I did not know much about America, but my parents told us it was our duty to help the Americans. My father was a Hmong military leader who was killed in combat in 1969. That same year, I joined the army at the age of 13. Although I feared for my life at every moment during the war, I managed to survive. But after the communists took power in 1975, anybody who sided with the Americans became an outcast in Laos. My family fled to the woods to survive. For 4 years, we were constantly running to avoid the gunfire from communist soldiers. Sometimes we went for days without food. Many people from my village died. Men, women, children, and elders. My family was lucky to escape many close encounters. Now, Day Project received great support for our work from the parents of Hmong American youth. In the most immediate sense, they saw this as an opportunity to keep their kids out of trouble, enhance their education, and expand their life opportunities. But in a deeper sense, Hmong parents strive to give their children a safe and promising childhood that war had stolen from their generation. Pang Blia Zhang met his wife in the Ban Vinai refugee camp. Chonburi was their first child, born in 1988, as they were planning to move to the U.S. Quote, in our culture, he said, the firstborn son is especially important because he will be the one to carry on our family name and heritage. In Detroit, Mr. Zhang worked factory jobs for auto parts suppliers and became a naturalized citizen. The east side of Detroit, however, was a difficult place to raise a child of any race in the 1990s. Schools, libraries, and parks faced crises and shutdowns. Violent crime rates soared amid the drug wars and crack epidemic. In his research on Cambodian Americans in the Bronx, Eric Tang, a scholar who draws on his experience as a community organizer, offered a sense of the hardships Southeast Asian refugee youth encountered in this era. Survivors of harrowing threats to their lives and well-being were resettled in distressed urban neighborhoods, often exposed as a small minority group within predominantly Black and Latino areas. Initially seen as, quote, easy marks, vulnerable to bullying and physical attacks, the youth learned to, quote, fight back to earn the respect of their tormentors. Acting to survive within the underground economy of the hyper-ghetto, some turned to drug dealing and robbery. Subjected to racial profiling, refugee youth became targets of the same aggressive policing and state violence hitting Black and brown communities. Now, although they were unfamiliar with Warren, the Zhang family moved to the city in 2003, crossing the 8-mile border and historic racial divide made famous by Eminem. Like many working-class families, they hoped to find a safe neighborhood and good schools. And they were not alone. The city that had long resisted racial integration was now undergoing rapid demographic change. The city's leadership, however, remained predominantly white. Reports of friction in schools and with police circulated among Black and Asian American residents. Quote, for nearly 3 years, we always considered our neighborhood safe, and we trusted the Warren police, Zhang said. We never imagined that our son, Chonburi, could be killed by police officers in our own home. The Zhang family contested public reports they deemed inaccurate and called for a more even-handed account. First, Chonburi had fired a gun in the house, but at the ceiling, not at them. Second, they had called for help the day before their son was killed. By the time police arrived, Chonburi had driven off. He later came home without incident. Thus, when the police returned the next day, the conflict had already subsided. Third, police entered the home without a search warrant or arrest warrant. Though they claimed the family invited them in, Zhang's parents disputed that point. Since their English was limited, it is easy to imagine miscommunication if an urgent, heated exchange occurred without a translator. Finally, the authorities disregarded what was perhaps the most troubling fact. Because of his past record, Chonburi was required to wear an ankle monitor. This meant the police could tell when he came and went from the house. If the officers believed they had probable cause to enter the Zhang home and use deadly force because Chonburi posed, quote, a threat of death or serious bodily harm to his parents, then it was grossly negligent of the police to allow him back into the house when they could have interceded him beforehand. Pang Liuzhang appealed to those in positions of authority as well as to the wider community. I ask everyone who is a parent, if you lost your child in this manner, wouldn't you be searching for answers? Wouldn't you do everything you could to see if your child's death could have been avoided? So I chose this excerpt for 3 reasons. And I also forgot to mention, when I think of Bao as the one person I'm writing for, I also, in honor of Bao, wore this Jeremy Lin jersey, which if no one else gets the reference but Bao, was worth doing. So I chose this excerpt, which I will, for reasons I'll point out briefly and then leave for the discussion. First, I want to acknowledge the Minnesotans who supported us when our little group with no resources launched the Justice for Chonburi Zhang campaign. In particular, I emailed Tu Zhang, and he immediately gave us expert counsel and important contact, and above all, agreed to drop what he was doing and fly to Detroit to donate a performance for a benefit event that greatly boosted our effort. So I just want to say that in tribute and in memory to Tujer. Second, addressing the problem of police brutality became a sadly necessary but important means to build Black, Asian, and multiracial solidarity. Black activists like Ron Scott, a former Black Panther, saw the clear connections between what happened to Chonburi Zhang and to cases he was dealing with as a leader of the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality. And third, as we look to address the root causes of anti-Asian violence, we need to go beyond policing and criminalization as a response. Of course, when we see blatant negligence and racism from the justice system, it is necessary and right to demand accountability. During the 1980s, the Justice for Vincent Chin movement advanced the popular slogan, "Jail the Racist Killers." And though further systemic bias allowed Chin's killers, Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz, to get off nearly scot-free, the movement was ultimately associated with the drive toward victims' impact statements, mandatory minimum sentencing, and hate crime laws that expand criminal charges and enhance sentences. Living in Detroit for 15 years, I must have shown Who Killed Vincent Chin around 40 or 50 times. So we should always remember the important lessons of the Vincent Chin case. But we should connect those to the story of Chonburi Zhang and other victims of state violence. Because what so many of our urban and working class youth need are alternatives to criminalization, better opportunities for education, arts, recreation, work, and youth leadership development. And to make this paradigm shift, we need to avoid what I call the perfect victim syndrome, whereby in order to bolster concern and awareness of anti-Asian violence, we limit the scope of who's impacted to those seen as middle-class professionals and college-educated Asians who are struck by random assailants and seemingly caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Working-class Asian immigrants and refugees are regularly subjected to structural violence, rendering them increasingly vulnerable to police brutality, racist attacks, and multiple forms of violence. And so with that, I want to invite Bo and Bao to join me on the stage for conversation.
On. I don't use a mic too often these days. So, Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Scott, for being here, and thank you, Bao, for the invitation. I think it's important to, one, thank you, Scott, for writing the book, as Bao said, because one of the things that Scott does really powerfully in the book is the idea that anti-Asian violence is not accidental, isolated, or disconnected from larger American society, right? And I think having worked in this community, especially in the context of, you know, a community that has had Asian Americans for many generations, and I think largely celebrated for their contributions, but very much invisible still. And then a large influx of Southeast Asians who really many people in America thought should not be brought here, without the recognition that whatever we do overseas comes back home, right? Always shows up. And I think that's what you talk a lot about, that we have to always connect these things. They don't happen in isolation. America chooses to use its power in ways that make many people around the world disposable, and then we expect not to see them here, right? And so when the big influx of Southeast Asians and came, it also changed the dynamics of who Asian Americans were, right, or are, because people had not known this community, and so were surprised at, you know, a population that arrived here with little education, who primarily were very rural people, if you will, because they were agrarian farmers mostly, and for the last several decades had been fighting alongside the Americans, and so arrived to school systems that did not have anything or any history of the population. And had to rebuild from there. So when I read this book, I think, Scott, what you do really well in American Peril is to make clear that what we have experienced has always been a part of the larger American systems, right? Whether empire building, labor exploitation, militarism, patriarchy, any of these economic fears, or the politics of belonging, which we are using more and more often, as if it's like something new, you know? Everybody is like talking about belonging as if, you know, this is the great new idea. And so when I read the book and I tried to think about what does it mean for the Minnesota context, right, is thinking about all of these things, about how when we disconnect and make things so isolated, that we lose track of actually what is happening in these systems, right? Even within our own communities, right? And I've been organizing here for a long time, and one of the things that we fought for was for data disaggregation, so that we can actually see both what the contributions and what the challenges are within different Asian ethnic groups. And some of our biggest challengers were actually other Asian Americans, right? Because they did not agree with the thought that we somehow wanted to be seen as who we are, and we should just accept that we were just Asians, and that they wanted their children to have opportunities to go to Harvard, and somehow if we saw that some kids were not doing well, that somehow it would take away their children's chances, right? So elected officials were surprised when we showed up at the Capitol and there were busloads of protesters against us who were also people who looked like us, and confusing legislators saying, we thought you were all in agreement. Right? And so it tells us how disconnected we are to our own truths, and how much more we still have to learn, and how important books like Scott's is, because it keeps us focused on these larger systemic threads that are so important as we do this work. Otherwise, we keep thinking, oh, our own community or this particular case, like that's isolated, right? Let's just work on that case. Let's just deal with, help that community. And certainly here in Minnesota, a place that is often imagined as progressive. Everywhere I go, everyone's like, how could that happen in Minnesota? It's so progressive. And I'm just like, oh gosh, that's a long conversation. Welcoming, right? Educated. My husband and I like to go to comedy shows, and I was told that comedians like coming to the Twin Cities to tape their shows because this is a highly educated population, but they do not, what do you call that? Heckle, yes. They do not heckle the comedian, so they get the joke and they just, applaud. But even when it's a bad joke, they don't heckle the comedian, right? So again, very educated and very civically engaged. So when you hear about the Asian American story, it's all the contradictions that you write about in the book, Scott, which is that we see communities invited in, and whether through war or labor, because that is the Asian American, and now higher ed, but then later treated as disposable, right? So in the latest raids, and when Asian Americans started, well, you can go back as far as you have, Scott, to document how cheap labor was the premise for bringing so many Asians to this country and then not be given citizenship or any kind of rights. And then for refugees and the deportation issue, which I've worked on forever since I was very young. When the law was first introduced, all kinds of red flags went up for me and a couple of organizers, and we started contacting elected officials to say, this is a terrible law because it's going to impact this refugee population in this way. And they said, oh, no, we don't mean it that way. You're going to be fine. The Hmong fought with us, so they're going to be fine. It's not going to end. Now we see the impact of that. Over 40,000 Southeast Asian families and individuals are impacted by what's happened since the 1996 immigration laws changed, right, making them deportable. So I just want to really just acknowledge how important this work is, Scott, and for us to really think about here in Minnesota about what our own story is so that we don't separate it, because I also think that sometimes when we have these conversations, it's like the Asian American story is East or West Coast and not here. So it is really important to make sure that I think we have the opportunities to dialogue about these larger themes and connections, how what is happening to Asian Americans is part of the American story, but what does it look like here at home, right? So,
thank you. And just really quickly, I just want to thank Bo. One of the other frustrations I have is, when ICE was happening, there were some people, including Asians, who would say, why aren't Asian people saying anything? Why aren't they doing anything? And I was like, there's Bo, there's like a bunch of people in this room, actually. I saw Asian Americans from all sectors of life, politics, community organizing, arts, not especially in Minnesota, but also across the nation doing stuff. And so one, thank you. And maybe it's a segue into a conversation I wanted to ask both of you. There's also this problem of narrative, right? It's so people believe, I feel like we can throw all this data at people. Like, we know the data. We know that Asian people suffer from this, but the narrative is we don't. And I think that until the narrative changes, you can throw all types of data or research at people, and they still will only look at what they believe. already believe. They'll only look at things that reinforce what they believe. And I'll say, like, there's truth to some of the stereotypes, right? Like, sure, some Asian people are staying out of it. Sure, we could be doing more. Sure, Asian people are problematic, yes. And, right? But the problem with racist narratives is that there's only the damaging ones that people believe, and they won't accept anything else, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. And I think, Scott, you do a really good job of that in your book. I think just giving us facts to kind of combat, I think, a lot of narratives that people may believe. And Bo, I know that that's the work that you've been doing too. So maybe we can talk about narrative a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing this book, there were really 3 points at the forefront of my mind thinking about the importance of narrative. The first is that, like, I never learned anything about Asian American studies, Asian American history in my K through 12 education, even really my college education. I had a dean once when we tried to get one Asian American studies class taught at the University of Pennsylvania. He said, well, it's really not a significant enough topic to have one entire class, right? They have a program now, which is great, but this was, when I was in college. But it's not just that, we didn't learn things. It's that things that happened were systematically covered up, erased, and distorted, right? So that's a big part of it. I mean, if you read the book, even I was shocked at how many things that I didn't even learn as an Asian American history professor until I was writing this book. The number of massacres of civilians or just Asian people in overseas wars, or even in peacetime, people being killed around Asian bases, violence against women, particularly at these bases in Asia, is just off the charts. And of course, as Bo was talking about, I mean, you cannot but see how that connects to the racism that drives the war, and then the war that expands racism, then it comes back. And particularly, I hadn't realized the extent to which, the vast majority, like the most common underlying factor in anti-Asian violence in the 80s, 90s, even late 70s, this Japan bashing that led to Vincent Chin's killing, I mean, I know about it. I was in Detroit. I'm Japanese American. It's very significant. But in terms of the actual documented cases of anti-Asian violence, it is almost really overshadowed by violence related to, anger about the Vietnam War, or particularly resentment against Vietnamese and Southeast Asian rich, or even like other Asian people perceived to be, Vietnamese or Southeast Asian. So it's the events that happen that have been systematically distorted, erased, from covering up, civilians being massacred. I mean, there were 1,000 people killed in this one incident after the U.S. declared the Philippine-American War was over, And then just time and again, the officials either saying it didn't happen, or like the Philippine-American War, they said this was like the most humanitarian example of a war that's ever been fought. Or, Truman saying the bombing of Hiroshima was an attack on an important Japanese army base, like completely discounting the fact that it was almost entirely civilians who were killed. So that's one. The second is that because of this constant erasure, we see time and again, like almost literally these exact words being used. This incident was not racially motivated. So even when the incident happens, the gaslighting comes in, right? This was not about race. This was just, a disturbed individual. And even when it's a disturbed individual, as was the case with, the Atlanta area spa shootings in March 2021, he said he told people he was suicidal. So what led him to target these Asian women in these Asian operated spas rather than commit suicide, or it wasn't just, he didn't just go on any street corner and start randomly shooting. He targeted these specific cases. So, even when we're talking about people who are disturbed or troubled or distressed in different ways, our societal messages make certain people more vulnerable than others. And the third is the point you are making about, is that along with that erasure, we never learned anything. I didn't learn anything about the history of Asian American activism, protest, resistance. I'm working on that now. But when I was a college student, even when I first got really interested in Black history, and I was basically I was like a history major, but it was basically a Black history major. I honestly thought, I remember saying this to people, like, Asian Americans never did anything for the civil rights movement, you know, and it's just not true. Literally, it's not true. There were Asian Americans in the Southern civil rights movement. But when you think more broadly about the struggle for social justice in U.S. history, there are a lot of examples that have simply been erased or distorted, and then we get these model minority stereotypes instead.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is about the whose responsibility is it to have the story, right? So one, our education system doesn't incorporate it anywhere. Now, even as schools have allowed for like Asian student clubs and those kinds of things, when it is not part of our learning system, then kids don't know, right? How are they supposed to know? Because I can tell my story, but it is not the story of how the system interacts with people, you know, from Asia, and then, you know, our immigration systems here and our economic and political systems and all of those things, right? So I think, to me, that narrative, but systems turn to us all the time as if we're supposed to speak for everybody now, right? So I just did a narrative project not too long ago where, and was specifically with Asian Americans in philanthropy, and so every time they hired an Asian person into a foundation, they almost felt like, oh, well, we don't have to now engage the community because we just turn to our staff, right? And those staff are supposed to now tell you everything about what Asians need and whether Asians are worthy of investments and all of those things, right? So to me, that's, you know, not only is it invisible and erased from our own, you know, ecosystem of learning, now we say the burden of educating institutions on what to do is on the people who look something like the people who are not being served, right? So I think that kind of juxtaposition of responsibility and systemic erasure is huge. I mean, it's no wonder people feel like they shouldn't say something when something doesn't feel right at their schools, right? Because the adults in that school doesn't even recognize that these students are part of a larger kind of system that has completely erased this community, right? We're in St. Paul. St. Paul School District, the largest student minority or student of, not just minority, any student population is Asian, largely Hmong, right? But until we did work on it in like 2012 or 13, 14, 15, 16, and so on, the school said, oh, we didn't know that. That's simply not true, right? Because they had been tracking data all along, but they were not required to report on it and therefore do anything about it, right? So all these kids were consistently, and their parents were consistently saying, we have these needs, we would like these services, but the whole system just kept ignoring them. Chinese became a global language before Hmong language before you could even take Hmong language from K through 12. If you wanted to do Hmong language from K through 12, you had to like move your kids like all over the place and hope that somehow there was a way for them to get that kind of language, right? So, you know, it's stuff like that where it's complicated and then it's simple, you know?
Yeah, for sure. A couple of things. So kind of what you were talking about, just as an example, right? When I went to my kids' public school, because I noticed that, there are all these, as a Southsider, talk about like the idea of being progressive, right? Where I raised my kid for part of their life, pretty multiracial, progressive neighborhood. And yet so many of the murals that call for solidarity, right? If they name race, it's Black, Latinx, Native. They name women, people with disabilities, queer folks, no Asian people, right? And so, like literally, we're the ones, everyone is explicitly named except for Asian people. And I have a problem with that. So I go to my kids' school, because there's an example of that. And I talk to them, the PTA meeting, and one of the teachers like, oh yeah, you're right. We didn't notice. And that, we can, like maybe during Asian History Month, we can like learn how to make Korean masks or something. And I'm like, look.
Let me read you my poem.
As a father, I have been practicing patience and trying to meet people where they are. So I said, the appreciation of culture and food and art is really important. And kids need to learn about Asian American history in a way that goes beyond that. And I say that as a story, as like that's another thing where I feel like even when we do say like we need to learn about Asians, it's like it's about some like like the head of the FBI who or like some Silicon Valley tech bro, like like it's all stuff that really. So there's that, and then but I wanted to, and then maybe after this we can ask questions from the audience. I think a thing that both of you do very well is that you, in the community activism, organizing, and the theorizing that you do, neither of you are like the solution is more police, or the solution is Asian people should be privileged over other people. Both of your work is really about progressive, multiracial grassroots organizing as a solution and as a way forward. And so I'm wondering if you two can both talk about like how did you get there? How does it feel when you go out into the world and with that as your ethos?
Yeah, I was thinking about the first part of your comment, and then something that Bo was stressing, this idea of Asians as being disposable, right? I think that's important because when we talk about not being represented or being invisible, that really becomes a moment, an opportunity, a teachable moment, right? And that's kind of a constant theme in my book to say, how and why did we get erased, right? So I think that's the first step in terms of making ourselves more visible, is not just, right, having, now we have, what's his name? The guy Aziz Ansari is playing on Saturday Night Live. So I think there's a couple things I just want to say first about that, right? There's this famous, General William Westmoreland quote during the Vietnam War, right? It's like, the Asian doesn't view life, like put the same high value on life that Westerners do. Life is cheap in the Orient, like that famous line. And it's like, on the one hand, the U.S. to become a global empire, to eclipse Spain and then eclipse Europe, entirely, needed to go into Asia, needed to do that obviously violently, since not everybody in Asia wanted the U.S. to come and invade them, needed to tell American soldiers that these people are of a lower race, that it's okay to kill tens and thousands and millions of people. If they die, it's because their lives weren't as valuable. And so we have those incidents, and yet there's this need to preserve this myth of American freedom, democracy, American acceptance. So it's like the violence had to happen, but then the erasure also had to happen for the U.S. empire to expand and present itself. And so I was just thinking about, like, remember the whole Barbenheimer phenomenon? I kind of missed the whole thing. I didn't see either of it, but if people saw Oppenheimer, if you remember Matt Damon's character, again, movie I didn't see, was this guy named Leslie Groves, General Leslie Groves, who was the head of the Manhattan Project. And initially, the Manhattan Project is literally set up to deny that radiation poisoning has any effect on civilians or babies or pregnant mothers. And they're just outright saying, like, if Japanese people are saying they're sick from radiation poisoning, like, that's just a lie. Like, maybe if they got killed in the blast, okay, we understand, but not from the after effects of radiation. And eventually they admit, yes, okay, this is a problem. And this Matt Damon character testifies before the Senate. He says, yes, it is a problem, but it's not nearly as bad as the Japanese are saying. And I've been told that radiation poisoning is a very pleasant way to die. I mean, this is like astonishing level, right, of just treating, again, Asian people as disposal. But the same thing with Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, right? And so we have, this notion, if you learn anything in school, you get one sentence, Chinese helped build the railroads, right? But we don't think about, like, only because in order to, like, maximize their profits, they wanted a cheaper labor source than white immigrants or white unionized workers. And then after they built the railroads and they had the last spike at Promontory Point in Utah, like, the Chinese workers couldn't even ride the trains back to California for free, right, on the tracks that they built. And so they go looking for jobs. And so why do 36 Chinese American workers get lynched in Rock Springs, Wyoming? It's because they were looking for work after the railroads, and these white workers were basically saying, no, you don't belong here, right? Why did 186 Chinatowns get completely uprooted during that era? It's because this idea that you don't belong here, right? And so it's like the labor is so needed, and yet, again, after it's done, that erasure becomes essential. And so I think that becomes a way to talk about how the politics of capitalism and white supremacy and empire work, and that becomes an entry point to talking with other communities who've been, in fact, impacted by some of these same phenomena, but maybe not in the exact same way. And we all put together the pieces of the puzzle so that we have a better understanding of this, like, beast that we're trying to, subdue.
Yeah, that's such a great response, Scott. I won't even add to that. But I'll go to your second question of, like, how do we do this work, right, in coalition and care of each other and things, because we don't have a choice, especially in this community when you are so you're not well understood, you don't get a lot of resources, so your only choice is to work with others, right? But I think in that that's actually what teaches you about what works, right? Is that isolation in the politics of scarcity and capitalism is actually not the way out. We're not going to build a different world. We're not going to be able to ensure all our future generations are thriving if we deprive them of relationships that are necessary for them to imagine something new, right? Because we are working against systems that by default, we every day are repeating the patterns that these systems have set up for us, right? So if you do nothing at all, you're gonna exist the way that we have, and you'll be fine in the way that you are fine now, right? But if you imagine that you matter, your children have great potential to do whatever they want, and that they should be celebrated in all the ways in which they exist, then that's not the system. Because this system asks them to forget about that, right? And to only care about the wealth that they can accumulate for themselves, and to isolate themselves and not worry about the people who are hungry or homeless or, detained or any of those things, So I think I came to this work because I didn't have a choice, but in it, I have learned that I have to do this work in ways that I have been taught by my ancestors, right? Which is that you have to care for the whole, and that you have to make room in your house for everyone, and that when you don't know people, you have to invite them and have long conversations. And so, in the work that I've done, sometimes that's been challenging, because I will have boards who will say, well, this isn't Asian centered and you're running an Asian organization. And, and I will say, no, because if we do it this way, we have a chance of winning. But if I only ask for the Asian, that's just going to happen while, someone thinks it's important, or while we are the most, the community that is most suffering. But it's not going to help after this period, right? So, in the politics of scarcity, Scott, I think what you describe in the book is we Asian Americans have a lot of work to do amongst ourselves, because we've, I think it's a good reminder about how the identity came to be, but also the realities of today is that oftentimes people don't call on this identity till we're in crisis. Right?
And then it's only during a very short window.
Yeah. And so I think we forget that there is politics behind it, and we actually have to keep politicizing it, because if we don't, then it is only saying, I'm only Asian American when, we're being beaten, or when we're being ignored, or when we're divested in those kinds of things. And I think then it doesn't serve that. And so I always go into spaces saying, yes, all these other identities and Asian Americans, right? And that's not because that's who I define myself only to be, but I understand what the consequences are if I don't acknowledge it in the system.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think, just to layer on two things, and then we can take questions. What do you think? So one thing I want to say is, so there's a scholar, Juliana Hupagis. We all know who that is. And a lot of her study was about how we will sometimes study these incidents of race in isolation, but not how they're connected. And so she taught me, again, a person who's cares about this stuff, but I didn't even know that how Japanese American internment and the Mexican Bracero program were linked. It was because when the government wanted to intern Japanese Americans, the Japanese Americans were laborers in the farm industry at that point, and they were like, well, if we imprison all of them, who's going to run the farms? And most of the white farmers were like, we'll figure it out. When they interned the Japanese Americans, they're like, well, now who's going to work the fields? And that's when the first Mexican Bracero program started. So again, I'm not trying to take her work. It's Juliana, but it's one example of how Asian American studies might study Japanese American internment. Chicano studies might study the Bracero movement, but we don't study the two of them and how they're linked. And so there's a way in which, again, we're not all the same, obviously, but we actually don't even know, we don't even know the history of when we're related with one another. And so I think that learning that and that's an ongoing process for me too. I'm not trying to be self-righteous. And then the other thing I'll say really quickly, since we started talking about funding and shit, and this is my little soapbox, and I'm not gonna get too into I want to tie it back into, I think, grassroots activism. And I'm just going to use, I know electoral politics is problematic, but I'm going to use it as an example of the difficulty of being an organizer on the Asian American left, okay? So you have Asian Americans, grassroots organizers who are doing really important work at the community level. I mean, as an example, Juan, I know you were part of movements of, Hmong and getting Hmong and Vietnamese language speakers going into Southeast Asian communities to talk about Black Lives Matter, because there was identified a language discrepancy happening, right, and misunderstanding. And there's this whole thing about Asian people who get their news from a certain language source and all the politics of that. There are grassroots people doing that. they have to struggle against not only conservative forces who are white, but also conservative forces who are Asian. And those conservative forces who are Asian actually get funded by conservative white people. Like, I'm not making stuff up. They will bus conservative Asian people in to disrupt Asian leftist shit. Like physically assault us. And yet the Asian grassroots people don't get funded. They don't get support because everybody thinks we're closest in proximity to whiteness. All the things, or that we're problematic, people feel entitled or to our labor, all the things, right? Don't get funded. The right wing gets funded. And then when the polls come, and then there's like, and some of these language sources in language have a very skewed version of the news. And that's where people get a lot of their news. And then people act all surprised. It's like, oh, wait, why are Vietnamese people voting so conservative? You know, like just as a, like, oh, it must be because they're inherently conservative, or like culturally they're conservative. And it's like, actually, you can systematically look, right? Because on the flip side of that, the positive side is there are certain places like Indian communities in Texas, Vietnamese communities in the South, like grassroots, who have been able to turn red counties because of their grassroots labor. So there's the good part too, but they're not getting funded. So that's my soapbox.
I was just going to add one point to your story about the internment. We had done kind of just a visit of the internment camps, and one of the things that is the stories about why so many Japanese internment camps were in native reservations was because the U.S. government could not invest in those infrastructure in those reservations. But if the Japanese were interned there, they could actually build water, and so if you go see some of those reservations, some of those structures are still the only structures on those reservations, right? There's people still use it as homes. And so to your point about how it's not just a study of us and Asian American stories and histories, it's about how all of us are racialized in service of white supremacy, right?
Yeah. And really quickly, the great scholar Gary Okahiro, may he rest in peace, pointed out that the Manifest Destiny Project in the United States, leading to like land theft and genocide of Native folks, they looked to the British Empire and how the British Empire pushed into India and China, going back to what you were saying, to expand their colony. That was a blueprint for Manifest Destiny in the United States, right?
Yeah, and I was just going to add, when we're talking about campaigns, at least in the moment where you can see a snapshot in time, the Mamdani campaign in New York City actually went into, organize working class Asian immigrant Muslim American communities. And so there were a number of folks who either didn't vote previously or voted for Trump thinking, I want lower prices, right? Like hoping something would happen. But when the campaign actually went to Oregon, it's like they just flipped thousands and thousands of voters and like boosted turnout dramatically. And so there's a podcast with called The Dig that interviewed organizers from DESI's Rising Up and Moving Drum, but also CAV organizing. So CAV started out talking about the problem of anti-Asian violence and needing to jail the racist killers and get hate crime laws. But they realized in order to get at the root cause of the problem, we need to organize around affordable housing and, the education of youth and fighting police brutality and other things. So that's one example. And then the group I profile even more, because I just got to know their work better through my own research, is Asian Americans United in Philadelphia. And so much of the work these groups do is based on organizing working class Asian American communities, but also building these multiracial alliances along the way. So I think we should open it though, yeah.
Yeah, and I have a microphone here for anybody that has questions in the audience. So please raise your hand and I can walk over to you.
Next one.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your funding point reminded me of the ADL, and I don't know, the relationship between Zionism and rhetoric. I don't know how to frame this intelligently, but I felt like you're nodding, so maybe you know what I'm talking about. But just the framing of anti-Asian violence in ways that don't serve us, like to your point about kill the racist. Yeah.
Also, Scott, I just saw Scott in the book draws parallels between. I'm just setting you up. In your book, you link imperial actions of military, certainly in Southeast Asia, but also what's happening in Palestine right now. And so I don't know if you want to write about or talk about that part of your book.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I was finishing the book, as the genocide in Gaza was happening. And even with this latest, bombing of the school in Iran, of course, Pete Hegseth and Trump are still denying, responsibility, let alone, apologizing or taking accountability for what happened. But there was even this New York Times editor / columnist who said, I can't believe, when did it come to be just the normal cost of war for the U.S. officials, for the U.S. officials to treat a civilian massacre as a normal cost of war? And that was just astonishing, because he's sort of acknowledging that his whole education has been to think that, oh, well, the My Lai massacre was bad, but that was the only time that happened, and you're supposed to get outraged when it happens. Not even realizing until I read this book by Nick Turst called Killing Anything That Moves. There was another U.S. massacre of Vietnamese civilians the same day as the My Lai massacre, right? So, one is it's happened so regularly that it was simply normalized by Biden and Trump and their whole generation that, the quote unquote Asian lives are cheap. So I think that's part of it. And that's why, to me, although it was atrocious, there was no mystery as to why Biden could just ignore that a genocide was happening, or not just ignore it, obviously continue to fund it and fuel it. And so I think there's that, but I think the other side to your question is, there's a danger in taking these sort of stories of taking these atrocities and turning them into model minority narratives, where it's this is what's taught. I've had some graduate students who's studying how in some right-wing or conservative-leaning Chinese language schools, they're teaching oh, Chinese exclusion was horrible, it's a terrible thing, but we rose above it, because we're the model minorities, right? And there's obviously we should never, of course, the Holocaust was horrible. Anti-Semitism in the form of Holocaust denial, neo-Nazis is rampant right now and should be opposed. But of course, that should not also be used to support sending money to the IDF for genocidal activities in Gaza, right? And so I think it's a similar thing. We don't want any stories of anti-Asian violence and racism to be used for some model minority discourses, and that's why Asian Americans should get into Harvard or Yale instead of minorities with affirmative action. And Trump kind of just gave away the whole game when he did this post just a couple of weeks ago when I was in San Francisco that said, and now the Chinese and Indian immigrants have taken over Silicon Valley, even though he said they're the birthright citizen, their anchor babies are now taking over, Silicon Valley, and they have all these high degrees, and they're now the yellow peril threat, that needs to be stopped, and so, and it's even when you buy into that, it's so opportunistic that, it's eventually, going to be exposed as a lie.
And just to touch on that really quickly, when some of us worked on the case of Feng Li, right, who was murdered by police, there were some people, including people from Asian American communities, who are well, maybe he was in a gang. You know what I mean? And so there's still that respectability politic where you need a perfect victim in order to be oh, he was just an innocent. And here's the thing, what we tried to say is whether or not he was in a gang, the cops still did not have the legal right to shoot him. But I hear what you're saying, we have to be very careful we don't fall into certain traps, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another thing, Scott, in your book, you talk about is the limitations of like using hate crimes as a strategy, right? Because the ADL and I won't name names, but you know, we have some very uber wealthy Asian Americans who now are proclaiming to be the anti-Asian violence like problem solvers, right? And what came out of their report was not a recognition that communities had been keeping themselves safe for a long time and deserve more support. It sort of said that Asians were not calling the police enough, right? And so we need to invest in, you know, these campaigns where Asians will call the police and where hate crime becomes, and they were supported by the ADL, right, to say, this is our strategy, this is how we did it, and, you know, you all need to create a center where you can track this kind of data and you can have these kinds of laws. And so, you know, I mean, I have too many feelings about that to talk more about it, but I think what you write about in your book is we can't lead with that, right?
Oh, there's one in the back.
Hello, thank you so much, Baobo and Scott, or Professor Kurashige. One thing that has been a little bit on my mind is like the way like the AI industrial complex may affect online discourse, and like already we have a lot of sort of, to what like Bao was saying earlier, there are like a lot of Asian Americans who will maybe post things about like ragging on other Asian Americans for not being active or whatever in even the occupation that happened. Like I was seeing folks who are like not from here who are Asian Americans who are saying that Asian Americans were not doing anything about this attack on Latinx and Somali immigrants, and I was like, you have no idea what's actually going on the ground. But that stuff also like catches fire really quickly, and it becomes very viral, and then that becomes sort of, that reinforces certain ideas that like y'all have been talking about. And I just like worry about, because AI is like an aggregating type of a thing, that it's going to like, that it takes from what is like already most available and like regurgitates it. And so I'm wondering if y'all have any thoughts on like combating that.
I was just going to say, before we run out of time, maybe we should see if there's any other questions and just take all of them together. Are there any other? Oh, there's one here.
I'm an old people and I might talk too much, but I'd like to do this at just 2 minutes and be cut off. My name is Marlon Heiss. 26 years I've been working with Hmong Archives. Our books are here, other stuff down below outside. My emphasis in collecting is how do Hmong fit into the world? And so when I find a book about Swedish Americans in the Twin Cities and they have several references to Hmong, that's something that we want in our library. The same with Korean Americans, Somali, Nuer people. It doesn't matter who they are, where they're from. That's something that we want to have collected here. One of the things that I think is really missing would be, we heard from the old days of Senator Mimua getting hate mail. What did she do with that stuff? She destroyed it. Wouldn't that have been a historical record that should have been kept for the grandchildren? And what are currently all of our Hmong representatives, senators and mayors and such people, what are they collecting of such hate mail? So my comment finished. Thank you, thank you.
Okay. Questions or other further?
Just trying to think how to quickly say this. So in thinking about like especially U.S. empire and reasons why Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders broadly have come into like the U.S. 48 states, a lot of times in broadly speaking social justice movements in the U.S., there's a necessary limitation to 48 states, right? And what happens, and the time frame is also very short. just wondering, maybe through how can you, what has helped to expand others' minds, right? To consider, how, for example, U.S. war in throughout Asia, the reasons driving people to come to this country in the first place, right, as a necessary grounding understanding for our existence within, supporting each other, as well as other, coalition movements, social justice spaces that is often completely erased. But like also the necessity to just straight up deny, and also this very short attention span and timeline.
Right. I don't have a. Oh. No, you're good. Please. Sorry, I forgot.
Hi, I had a question. Do any of you know of any spaces, maybe national spaces, where like historians and researchers, storytellers, and artists are coming together, kind of to your point about narrative, to create, alternative narrative stuff to put out there?
Oh, yeah. Other stuff before we try? I'm not going to say a lot, but there's in several of the comments, a thread that I want to pull on is culture, right? And I'm not talking just about us, but like American culture, activist culture, intellectual culture, lefty culture. Because again, I keep going back to like the data is there, and yet culturally people believe certain things about Asian Americans that just aren't true. And so how do we change the culture, whether it's through figuring out how to manipulate AI or destroy it, I don't know. You know what I mean? Or through education and discussion or archiving, I don't know, but I think culture is an important arena for us to think about.
Yeah, I'll let Scott end for us. But yeah, there's so many things going through my head. I mean, I think one is, Marlon, I think the community keeps its stories, but it is not the way that Western Americans keep their stories, right? When I was growing up, we had circle stories every night with my parents, right? It was their way of passing knowledge onto us and passing the family story onto us about, how many generations ago my ancestors came from China and all of those stories. But I think in a society where you say you have to be in print to be truth, I think it's very hard. So I would just challenge us to honor how communities keep their stories and to actually invest in that, instead of saying you're only going to be important when you're in a book, right? Because I think many of us come from cultures where story is the way that we exist with each other, and that's why you give so much time and energy to the relationship. But now it's almost like, just read this. I'm just going to send you an article so that you know more about my people. So that's one thing. And then I would say that something that AI can't do is replace our values and our connections to each other. And if we don't build more out of that, one of the things that happened in the hate crimes legislation that passed that we did not support, and we're one of the only Asian American groups who are saying, nope, sorry, we're not signing on to that, was because they wanted to give more money to police and the FBI. And we said no. We said we could think about supporting it if you were going to give more money for more community building efforts, so that neighbors got to know each other. Because a lot of these incidents that occurred happen in poor neighborhoods between Black and brown people. even though the hate crimes law passed because of what was happening to Asian Americans in the midst of, COVID, right? So I think we're not investing in human connectivity and human values and all of those things. And so I would just say, if you're a teacher, please help your kids be connected to each other. If you are funders, fund that. If you are, we just have to be more in presence with each other. And what's happening now with the erasure of curriculum and all of these things is like, didn't we teach our kids that you don't learn, like the most successful people have failed 100,000 times or something? And so if we just teach this winning narrative, like who are we in the world? I mean, at the expense of what, right? So anyway, more to say, but Scott?
When I was first, I mentioned there were no Asian American Studies classes at my college, and we were trying to just get one class taught by an adjunct, right? And so there was a big push at that time by people in Asian American Studies to say, we need to institutionalize. And yet, we see like there are literally all these programs that have been institutionalized in ethnic studies, women, gender studies are being like eliminated from places like Texas A&M and, Florida and Indiana and so-called. So you can invest so much in institutions and yet not address the problem that these institutions are part of this bigger system, right? Or the same thing with so much of the money that's gone into nonprofits, that can prop things up and it could sustain people, but, that funding itself does not build a movement and does not, create long-term sustainability. And so, I think the same thing can happen, right, with, all these media sources when they are in control of other platforms and algorithms. We can't have true self-determination. So I think about the origins of the Asian American movement was before the internet, it was before we had all these things, and it required people to build relationships, right? So that Grace Lee Boggs comment that movements are born not of critical mass, but critical connections like this are so important to me. And so Bao, talking about schools, but also writing children's books to just create a sense of community and like think about like T. Bowie's The Best We Could Do. This like brilliant graphic novel, like ways of communicating that. I think that gets the answer to your question and the question of like how do we go beyond just like what the AI and the social media conglomerations can control. Or I even think of like how did like I also can't come to Twin Cities thinking of like I'm a huge Replacements fan, it's like I think of like Minnesota like music, like that whole era of college radio music. Again, there were technologies that people used, but it mostly was like people like I've been talking about this book. So if I'd come up with the book 5 years ago, I could have caught this like wave of all this attention for, anti-hate, work among Asian Americans. But that could have just been like something that came and went really quickly, right? So I've been talking about the book more like I'm an indie band on tour, like going wherever people will. And thanks to the JSU was going to put me up, like let me crash on your couch. Like I'll just go anywhere, like, and that's like what Woody Guthrie did for years and years and years. But I was just also thinking about that. Like I'm feeling kind of old because I was like, Bob Mould is now doing like the Sugar, like 30-year reunion. I'm just like, wait, like 30 years for Sugar? Like who even thinks about Sugar, right? Compared to like Husker Du. Anyhow, there are so many examples we have and are still ongoing to this day of like the movements arising from below. It's like also Grace used to say the answers are coming from below. And the reality is when they come with all the money and the baggage or the strings, part of the problem, I think, with a lot of even progressive Asian American work is it's in a bubble. And I've been in that bubble for a long time, so I know. Bubble of people who come from elite universities, college educated, have nonprofit funding or university connections, and are talking mostly to themselves and not to those like working class, like Asian immigrant refugee voters who might have voted for Trump or might not be connected at all to the discourse we're using And how do we better understand that? I'm working a lot more in community colleges, so I'm reaching a whole different demographic than when I was at like an elite research university. But I just think the answers are not easy, right? That's there are no easy answers. And that's, I think, one of the most important lessons. We have to constantly be learning, engaging, sharing. And that's why, again, I'm just so glad to see everybody here today to really be part of that.
And maybe that's a really great place to end it, talking about critical relationships. With that in mind, thank you to Eastside Freedom Library. Thank you to the Minnesota Historical Society. Thank you to, is it Twin Cities or Minnesota JACL? Twin Cities JACL. Really anybody who like emailed somebody or dragged somebody here or however you got somebody here, helped us spread the word. Seriously, thank you all. And thank you, Bo. Thank you, Scott.
Oh, and yeah, thank you, Vameng and Sia Books. Bao, are you willing to sign books too? Okay, I'm happy to sign books if people are interested in that.
Buy Scott's books first, though. I'm serious.